The spring blizzard that had paralyzed Cold Creek for 3 merciless days broke with a violence that took the Wyoming Territory by surprise. When the thaw arrived on the morning of April 23, 1878, it came not as relief, but as catastrophe. Snowmelt cascaded from the Medicine Bow Peaks in roaring torrents, transforming placid creeks into brown serpents that devoured everything before them. By gray dawn, Main Street had ceased to exist as anything recognizable. It was now a churning river, clawing at foundations, splintering fences, dragging livestock to their deaths in the muddy current. Clara Weiss clung to the pitched roof of Hendrick's livery stable. Her fingers scraped raw against the weathered shingles as icy water lapped closer with each passing minute. 26 years old, with sharp gray eyes that cataloged every mechanical detail, and a right leg withered from childhood polio that left her dependent on crutches, she had crawled to this precarious perch when the ground floor flooded an hour past. Her oak crutches, carved to fit her grip, perfectly worn smooth by years of use, were gone, swept away in the first brutal surge. Pressed against her chest was a waterproof leather case, its brass buckles digging into her ribs through the rough wool of her work dress. Inside lay blueprints and specifications for a modified high-pressure steam engine she had been tuning for Harlan Harrow's freight mill. The prototype was meant to revolutionize timber transport through the mountain passes, increasing capacity by 40% and securing Cold Creek's economic future. Clara had staked everything on perfecting that engine. But 1 week earlier, during the test run with investors watching, the machine had seized with a sound like a cannon shot gears, locking pressure, spiking the main drive shaft, snapping and sending shrapnel spinning across the mill yard. Foreman Reed had accused her immediately, his voice carrying over the shocked crowd. Sabotage. That immigrant woman did it deliberate, probably working with them railroad saboteurs out of Denver trying to stall our contracts. Clara had stood her ground, despite the hostile circle tightening around her, despite her bad leg trembling from exhaustion after 14 hours hunched over that engine's innards. The specifications you provided were fundamentally flawed. She had countered, her Austrian accent thickening with fury. The gear ratios cannot hold under operational load. I documented my concerns in writing 3 days before the test. This failure is not my doing. But frontier towns did not trust outsiders, especially foreign women who worked with their hands and spoke in technical language that sounded like witchcraft to uneducated ears. Only Dr. May Kittredge's intervention, the 40-year-old physician whose clinic above the Mercantile treated everyone regardless of ability to pay, had prevented immediate arrest. She is right more often than wrong, Dr. May had stated flatly. And those blueprints trouble me. Something about them is not correct. Harrow had grudgingly returned Clara's leather case, but dismissed her with a warning that she would never work in Cold Creek again. She had limped back to a rented room above the feed store, reputation in ruins, savings, dwindling confidence, shaken for the first time since her older brother Carl's death, from consumption 2 winters before she scraped together passage to America. Now, as the stable groaned beneath her and debris battered the walls, a spinning wagon wheel tangled chicken wire, the bloated carcass of a milk cow. Clara clutched Carl's legacy and wondered if she would drown before proving her innocence. A section of roof shingle cracked under her left palm. Clara jerked backward, heart-hammering, as the fragment tumbled into the flood. The entire structure listed eastward. Minutes remained before total collapse. Then, cutting through wind and water, came a sound wholly unexpected and the rhythmic splash of a pole-striking current. Clara lifted her head, blinking against sleet. Emerging from the gray chaos was a makeshift raft, 3 cottonwood logs lashed with rawhide, a salvaged barn door secured across the top. Poling it with the focused intensity of a man navigating rapids was a figure she recognized despite having never exchanged more than a handful of words with him. Red Hawk, The Cheyenne Warrior stood balanced on the raft's edge, his broad shoulders flexing as he drove the pole deep into the submerged street, fighting the current with methodical power. He wore soaked buckskin pants darkened nearly black, and a wool shirt that clung to his torso, its cheap dye bleeding in streaks. His hair, black as a raven's wing, was bound with a single hawk feather plastered against his skull. Water streamed from his strong jaw as he angled toward the stable with river-wise focus. Clara had noticed him before. Impossible not to given Cold Creek's population of barely 200 souls, and Red Hawk's tendency to keep to the settlement's fringes like a wary wolf. He broke horses for homesteaders, traded Mustangs to cavalry scouts, and lived in a lean-to north of town where prairie met foothills. People spoke of him in careful, neutral tones, reserved for things neither trusted nor entirely unwelcome. He was Cheyenne, and these were dangerous times for his people. Little Bighorn was only 2 years past revenge raids and cavalry reprisals, turning the territory into a powder keg. Most bands had been forced onto reservations, but Red Hawk remained solitary, watchful, inscrutable. Irrational fear flooded Clara's chest as the raft drew near. She had never been harmed by any Indian, never even conversed with one. But newspaper accounts of massacres and lurid dime novels had poisoned her imagination despite her usual rationality. When the raft bumped the stable's corner, Red Hawk looked up. Their eyes met across 20 feet of howling wind and churning water. His face was broad and weathered, perhaps 28 or 29 years of age, with a white scar cutting through his left eyebrow, and eyes the color of river stones, gray-brown and unreadable. He did not smile, did not speak, simply braced the raft with his pole and gestured once toward the roof's edge, a sharp motion of command. Clara's throat tightened with panic. "Please," she called out, voice cracking. "Please do not hurt me. I cannot move. My leg, I cannot—" Her words died as Red Hawk, without acknowledging them, secured his pole and climbed onto the stable's eave with startling agility. The roof groaned under additional weight tiles, slipping and plunging into water below. He moved toward her on all fours, distributing his weight, eyes fixed on her with the same focus he had used navigating the flood. Clara's pulse hammered. The leather case pressed into her ribs. She could not run, could not fight, could only watch as this stranger closed the distance. Red Hawk stopped an arm's length away. Up close, she saw exhaustion etched into his features, the way his jaw worked as he assessed her position. His gaze flicked to her twisted right leg, then to the case clutched against her chest. He extended his hand palm upward, not threatening, not supplicating, just practical. Waiting. Clara stared at the hand-calloused, scarred nails, blunt and stained from work, then at his face. She saw no cruelty there, no lust, no contempt, only grim determination that matched her own stubbornness, the look of someone who had decided on action and would see it through. Slowly, she released one trembling hand from the case and placed it in his. His grip was firm and surprisingly warm despite the icy water. He pulled her toward him with careful strength, his other hand bracing her shoulder. "Hold the case," he said, his voice low and rough, the first words he had spoken to her. "Do not let go." Clara nodded mutely. He shifted position, looping a woven sash, Cheyenne work dyed red and black around her torso, and tying it with swift efficiency. Then he lifted her. Not roughly, not carelessly, but with methodical competence. He cradled her against his chest, one arm beneath her knees, the other supporting her back, and carried her across the disintegrating roof as though she weighed nothing. The stable gave a final tortured groan. Red Hawk leaped from the eave onto the raft, just as the roof collapsed behind them, sending up a geyser of filthy water and splintered timber. The raft rocked violently, but he landed with knees bent, absorbing impact, and immediately dropped to one knee to set Clara on the barn door. She gasped, clutching the case body, shaking uncontrollably from cold and shock. Red Hawk unwound the sash and secured it around her waist again, tying the other end to a cleat fashioned from a bent horseshoe. "Stay low," he instructed. "Current is strong." He retrieved his pole and began working them away from the wreckage movements, powerful and deliberate. The flood carried them southward toward the collapsed bridge that had once spanned Cold Creek proper, now a tangle of broken timbers and twisted iron jutting from the water, like the ribs of some drowned leviathan. Clara watched him work, fear slowly giving way to numb awareness. He had not hurt her, had not hesitated, had simply acted as though saving a crippled immigrant woman from drowning was the most natural thing in the world. The raft spun as they hit a cross-current. Debris pelted them, a cast-iron stove door, clanging off the logs, a length of barbed wire snagging the pole. Red Hawk adjusted stance muscles coiling as he fought to steer clear of the bridge wreckage looming ahead. Clara's gaze locked on his face, on water streaming from his hair, on the way his chest heaved with exertion. She realized with cutting clarity that she owed this man her life. "Thank you," she said, voice barely audible over the roar. Red Hawk did not look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the bridge. But his jaw tightened, and he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Then the current seized them, and they were hurtling toward twisted metal and splintered wood, the world reduced to water and the hammering of Clara's heart against the leather case. The dead cow struck them broadside without warning. Clara screamed as the bloated carcass slammed into the raft, its swollen belly rupturing on impact and releasing a stench so foul she retched. The raft tilted violently, logs twisting against rawhide lashings. Red Hawk dropped to one knee, driving his pole into the riverbed to stabilize. But the current was merciless. The raft flipped. Clara plunged into water so cold it stopped her breath. The sash around her waist yanked tight, jerking her sideways. She flailed instinctively, bad leg, useless good leg kicking against nothing. Water filled her mouth, her nose lungs burning as she fought for surface. A hand seized her collar. Red Hawk hauled her up his face, appearing through murk expression, grimly focused. He shoved her toward something solid, the collapsed bridge's stone sill, half submerged but stable. Clara's hands found purchase on rough granite, and she clung to it, coughing and gasping while Red Hawk pulled himself up beside her. The raft was gone, tumbling downstream with the cow carcass still tangled in its wreckage. They were stranded on a narrow granite ledge, waist-deep in surging water, with the bridge's chaotic maze of timbers surrounding them. Red Hawk's left hand was bleeding a deep gash across his palm where a protruding nail had torn flesh. He seemed not to notice. His gaze swept the area, calculating. Then he pointed downstream, the feed store, its second story still above water window, glowing with lamplight. "There," he said. "Can you hold on?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Red Hawk unwound the sash from her waist and looped it around both of them, creating a tether. He found a length of good hemp rope tangled in bridge debris, frayed but serviceable, and fashioned a crude grappling hook from a bent iron bracket. He swung it twice and released. The hook sailed through air and caught the feed store's window frame with a solid thunk. Red Hawk tested the rope, grunted satisfaction, then turned to Clara. "Hold the case. Hold me. Do not let go." She wrapped her free arm around his neck, leather case pressed between them, and locked her legs around his waist as best she could manage. He gripped the rope and began pulling them across the gap, hand over hand current dragging at them like a living thing determined to claim them. They reached the window. Red Hawk kicked it open glass, shattering inward, and hauled them both through. They collapsed onto the feed store's upper floor, water streaming from their clothes chests, heaving. The room was crowded with survivors, a dozen people huddled in blankets, faces pale and shell-shocked. "On a nor," May Kittredge moved among them distributing salvaged medical supplies. She looked up as Red Hawk and Clara tumbled through the window, sharp eyes taking in their condition. "You two look half drowned," Dr. May said, already reaching for bandages. She was rail-thin and tireless, graying hair, pinned in a practical bun, hands that could set bones or deliver babies with equal competence. She had arrived in Cold Creek 10 years earlier with a medical degree from Philadelphia and a refusal to turn away patients based on ability to pay or skin color. His hand, Clara managed, nodding toward Red Hawk. Dr. May crouched beside him gently, turning his palm upward. "That is deep. Needs stitching." She cleaned the wound with whiskey and threaded a needle with practiced efficiency. Red Hawk's jaw tightened, but he made no sound as she worked her stitches small and neat. "You saved her life," Dr. May observed quietly, tying off the thread. "That was brave work." Red Hawk's gaze flicked to Clara, then away. Water does not care about bravery. Dr. May wrapped his hand in clean linen and moved to other patients. Clara remained on the floor, back against the wall, legs stretched awkwardly. She should say something more, she knew. Express gratitude more eloquently than her choked words on the raft. But exhaustion pulled at her like an undertow. Red Hawk sat beside her, not touching, maintaining careful distance. His wet hair dripped onto floorboards. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, revealing a long scar that looked like a knife wound. "Why did you come for me?" Clara asked finely, voice barely above a whisper. Red Hawk was silent for a long moment. "Then you were alone." Not a romantic answer, not even particularly kind. Just a statement of fact delivered in a tone suggesting he would have done the same for anyone in similar circumstances. Somehow that mattered more to Clara than any declaration of chivalry. She looked down at the leather case and carefully unbuckled it, withdrawing the blueprints and spreading them on the floor. In dim lamplight, with the flood's roar muted by walls, Clara studied the diagrams with fresh eyes. There in the margin of the gear assembly schematic. A mark she had glimpsed before, but not truly registered. Small, precise, stamped into the paper itself, H.H. Harlan Harrow's initials. Clara's breath caught. She traced the letters with a trembling finger, mind racing. These were not her tuning notes. These were not even the original Denver specifications. Someone had substituted them, replaced genuine diagrams with sabotaged versions, and marked them with Harrow's initials. "What is it?" Dr. May's voice cut through Clara's thoughts. The doctor had finished with other patients and now stood over her curiosity, sharpening her features. Clara tilted the blueprint toward light. "These are not the correct specifications. This gear ratio is mechanically impossible. It would bind immediately under load. But this mark..." She pointed to the initials. "This is from a Denver foundry stamp, but the initials are Harrow's own." Dr. May crouched down, eyes narrowing as she examined the mark. "You are saying Harrow ordered faulty specifications intentionally?" "Or had them altered?" Clara replied. "Either way, he knew the engine would fail. He wanted it to fail." "To what purpose?" Dr. May frowned. "He stands to lose the most from a failed engine." Clara shook her head slowly, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "Unless he profits another way. Engine failure delays freight contracts, giving him leverage to renegotiate terms and demand town funding for repairs. And if the town cannot pay, he forecloses on debts." Dr. May finished, voice grim. "Eli Boone owes him 2 years of mortgage payments. The Hendricks are barely holding on. Half the homesteaders in this valley are in his pocket already." A new voice cut through their conversation, smooth, authoritative, unwelcome. "That is a serious accusation, ladies." Deputy Silas Dodd stood in the doorway, water dripping from his oiled canvas slicker boots, polished despite mud outside. 32 years old, with a carefully groomed mustache and the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to deference, he had arrived in Cold Creek 6 months earlier, appointed by the territorial governor. He had immediately aligned himself with the town's powerful men, chief among them Harlan Harrow, a speed of alliance that had struck Clara as oddly eager at the time. Serious accusations require serious evidence. Dodd continued stepping into the room. His hand rested casually on the butt of his Colt revolver, not quite a threat, not quite innocent. Dr. May stood placing herself between Dodd and Clara. The evidence is in the blueprints. Harrow sabotaged his own engine. Or Miss Weiss did. Dodd replied smoothly. After all, she was the one with access. She had motive revenge for being doubted by men who know this territory better than some foreigner. That is absurd. Clara snapped, anger overriding exhaustion. Why would I destroy my own reputation? Why would the richest man in Cold Creek destroy his own engine? Dodd countered. What does he gain? Before Clara could respond, Red Hawk spoke from his position on the floor, voice quiet but carrying. Water is rising differently now. The dam is failing. Everyone turned to look at him. Red Hawk had moved to the window and stood staring out at the flooded landscape, expression unreadable. The current has shifted direction, he continued. It hits the dam foundation from a new angle. The wall is undercut. It will fail before dawn. The lower flats will flood the boarding house, the school, Eli Boone's homestead. Dodd's confidence faltered. Ma, how can you possibly know that? Red Hawk did not answer. He simply pointed toward the dark shape of Harrow's mill upstream, where the retaining wall held back swollen creek water. Even from this distance, Clara could see water frothing around the structure's base, eating away earth beneath mortared stones. If that wall goes, Dr. May said slowly, dozens will drown. Silence fell heavy and oppressive. Outside, the flood roared on, indifferent to human schemes and fears. Somewhere in the darkness, a wall of water was gathering strength, preparing to sweep away everything in its path. The hours between midnight and dawn on April 24, 1878, were among the longest of Clara Weiss's life. While Dodd organized an evacuation of the lower flats, his authority as deputy making him the default commander, despite Clara's warnings about the dam, she, Red Hawk, and Dr. May worked in the cold darkness to shore up what they could. The immediate crisis was the dam, but Clara's engineering mind saw other vulnerabilities that the deputy either could not grasp or chose to ignore. The overflow channel that fed away from the dam had a secondary weakness, a stone culvert beneath the mill road that was already cracked from the initial flood surge. If that culvert collapsed, the redirected water would undermine the mill's foundation and possibly create a secondary flood pulse that would hit the lower flats from a different angle, trapping anyone attempting to evacuate via the main road. We have to reinforce that culvert, Clara insisted as she, Red Hawk, and Eli Boone stood in the mill yard examining the situation by lamplight. Eli had returned after getting his daughter to safety, driven by gratitude and a desperate need to do something useful. With what? Eli asked, gesturing at the wreckage surrounding them. Most of the lumber is waterlogged or washed away. Clara's eyes scanned the yard methodically, her mind cataloging materials and calculating load-bearing requirements. There, a pile of iron barrel hoops, discarded near the mill's cooperage shed. And there, several lengths of chain, used for hauling logs, tangled but intact. We do not need lumber, Clara said, already moving toward the materials despite her awkward gait without crutches. We need tensile strength and flexibility. Iron and chain woven into a mesh and anchored on both sides of the culvert. It will not stop the water, but it will prevent the stone from shifting further. Red Hawk understood immediately. He began gathering the barrel hoops while Eli worked on untangling the chains. Clara directed them with the precision of an orchestra conductor, calculating angles and load distributions in her head. Her hands were still blistered from the valve wheelwork earlier, but she ignored the pain, using a salvaged piece of canvas as makeshift gloves. The work was brutal. They had to wade into waist-deep water to access the culvert's upstream side, working by feel as much as sight, weaving iron hoops through the chain links and wedging the assembly into the cracked stonework. The current fought them constantly, trying to tear the materials from their grip. Clara's bad leg made her clumsy in the water, but she compensated by wedging herself between rocks, using her upper body strength to hold position while her hands worked. "This is madness." Eli gasped at one point, his teeth chattering from the cold. "We are going to drown trying to save a culvert. We are going to drown if we do not save it." Clara replied, her accent thickening with exhaustion and determination. "The math is simple. This culvert fails the mill foundation, fails the secondary flood hits in 3 hours when people think they are safe. I have seen it happen before in Vienna when the Danube flooded in '62. We lost 200 souls to a secondary surge that no one anticipated." The memory drove her forward. Carl had been there, had pulled her from the water when she was too weak to swim. He had died saving people from mechanical failures others ignored. She would not let history repeat itself here. By the time they finished, the sky was beginning to lighten to the east. The iron and chain mesh was crude but functional, distributing the water pressure across a wider area and preventing the cracked stones from shifting further. It would not hold forever, but it would hold long enough. Dr. May met them as they staggered back to higher ground, her arms full of blankets and a flask of whiskey that she insisted they all drink from. "You 3 look like drowned rats," she observed. "But you may have just saved 50 lives, though no one will know it, because the disaster you prevented will not happen. Engineering is like that," Clara said, accepting the whiskey and taking a small sip that burned all the way down. "The best work is invisible because it prevents failure rather than repairing it." Red Hawk said nothing but, as they stood there watching the culvert hold against the current, his hand found Clara's and squeezed briefly, a gesture of acknowledgement between people who understood each other without needing words. The sun rose on April 24th to reveal a transformed landscape. Main Street was still buried under mud and debris, but the waters had receded enough for people to begin the slow process of salvage and recovery. The dam held groaning but intact. The culvert held Clara's improvised reinforcement doing its job invisibly. But Clara's work was far from finished. She needed more than engineering solutions. Now she needed proof of Harrow's conspiracy that would stand up to scrutiny, because Dodd had made it clear he would support Harrow's version of events unless confronted with irrefutable evidence. "The mill office," Clara said to Dr. May as they stood in the mill yard surveying the damage. "If Harrow ordered those false specifications, there will be correspondence. Invoices. Something in writing that ties him directly to the Denver foundry." "The office flooded," Dr. May pointed out. "Documents may be destroyed." "Paper can survive water if treated properly," Clara replied. "And Harrow strikes me as the kind of man who keeps meticulous records of his schemes. He would want documentation to protect himself if his co-conspirators tried to betray him." Dr. May considered this. "You are thinking like a criminal." "I am thinking like an engineer," Clara corrected. "Every system has vulnerabilities. Every criminal has a paper trail. We just have to find it." The mill office was a disaster. Water had risen to waist height during the flood, and the room was now a soup of floating papers, overturned furniture, and mud. But the office also had a small iron safe in the corner positioned on a raised platform that had kept it above the worst of the flooding. "That," Clara said, pointing at the safe, "that is where he would keep anything truly incriminating." The problem was immediately apparent. The safe was locked, and Clara had no key and no idea how to crack it. She stood before it for a long moment, studying the mechanism with her engineer's eye. It was an older model, probably dating to the 50s, with a simple 3-tumbler lock. Not sophisticated by the standards of the day, but still beyond her ability to pick without tools. Red Hawk had been exploring the office, and now he returned carrying a crowbar and a sledgehammer he had found in the mill's tool shed. "We break it," he said simply. Clara shook her head. "The noise will draw attention. Dodd patrols this area, and if he finds us breaking into Harrow's safe, he will arrest us for theft, regardless of what we find inside." "Then we need a distraction," Dr. May said thoughtfully. "Something that draws Dodd and his men away long enough for you to work." What they devised was simple, but effective. Dr. May would report a medical emergency at the far end of town, a fictitious case of a child trapped in a collapsed cellar. It was the kind of crisis Dodd could not ignore without looking callous, especially with witnesses present. That would give Clara and Red Hawk perhaps 20 minutes to access the safe and search for evidence. But Clara still needed a way into the safe without making excessive noise. She studied the mechanism again, then turned her attention to the safe's construction. It was riveted iron plate strong, but not impregnable. The door hung on 2 hinges, and hinges were mechanical components subject to wear and stress. "The hinges," Clara said half to herself. "We do not attack the lock. We remove the hinges." She needed tools. Red Hawk searched the mill and returned with a selection of cold chisels, a small pry bar, and a can of machine oil. Clara set to work immediately. The hinges were old and slightly rusted, which worked in her favor. She applied oil liberally, letting it seep into the hinge pins, then used the cold chisel and pry bar to work the pins upward. It was delicate work. Too much force would damage the mechanism, and make noise too little would accomplish nothing. She worked by feel as much as sight, her blistered hands protesting every movement, but her mind entirely focused on the task. Red Hawk kept watch at the door, his Winchester rifle leaning against the frame, his eyes scanning the street for any sign of Dodd's return. The minutes stretched into a tense eternity. Finally, the first hinge pin came free. Clara set it aside carefully and moved to the second. This one was more stubborn, the threads corroded and binding. She applied more oil, waited 30 seconds, then tried again. The pin shifted, moved upward an inch, then jammed. Clara swore under her breath in German, a habit from childhood that resurfaced under stress. She adjusted her angle, used the pry bar to apply lateral pressure while tapping the chisel from above, and felt the pin suddenly give way. It slid free, and the safe door sagged on its locked side, now supported only by the bolt mechanism. "Now we pry," Clara said, wedging the crowbar into the gap between door and frame. Red Hawk added his strength to hers, and together they levered the door open with a metallic groan that made Clara wince. But the sound was not as loud as breaking the lock would have been, and within seconds they had the safe open. Inside was exactly what Clara had hoped for, a stack of correspondence, bundled with string a ledger book and a smaller cash box. She grabbed the papers and began sorting through them with frantic speed, her eyes scanning for anything relevant. There, a letter from a Denver foundry dated 6 months earlier, acknowledging receipt of modified specifications per your instructions, and confirming the order number. The letter was signed by a foundry manager and addressed to Mr. H. Harrow, Cold Creek Freight Mill, Wyoming Territory. Clara's hands trembled as she read it. This was it. Direct evidence that Harrow had commissioned the alterations. But there was more. Another letter, this one from someone named S. Dodd, addressed to Harrow at a private residence rather than the mill. The letter was dated 8 months earlier, before Dodd had arrived in Cold Creek. "Dear cousin," it began, and Clara's breath caught. She read quickly, her mind racing. The letter laid out a plan. Dodd would accept the appointment as deputy in Cold Creek, establish himself as a reliable lawman, and then work with Harrow to create opportunities for land acquisition through engineered financial crises. They would split the profits according to an attached agreement. The letter was signed, "Your devoted cousin Silas." Dodd was Harrow's cousin. The rapid alignment was not opportunism, it was family conspiracy planned from the beginning. "We have him," Clara breathed. "We have them both." She gathered the letters, the ledger, and several other documents that appeared relevant, stuffing them into her leather case alongside the blueprints. Just as she finished, Red Hawk hissed a warning from the door. "Dodd is coming. 2 minutes, maybe 3. They could not be found here. Clara closed the safe door as best she could, though the missing hinge pins made it impossible to secure properly. They would know it had been breached, but with luck, they would not know immediately what had been taken. Clara and Red Hawk slipped out the back of the mill office, moving as quickly as Clara's mobility allowed. They cut through the mill yard, using stacked lumber and equipment as cover, and made their way to Dr. May's clinic. The doctor was already there, having concluded her distraction after seeing Dodd heading back toward the mill. "Did you find anything?" Dr. May asked urgently. Clara laid the documents out on the examination table. "We found everything. Letters proving Harrow commissioned the false specifications. Letters proving Dodd is his cousin and co-conspirator. Financial records showing debt schemes targeting specific homesteaders. It is all here." Dr. May examined the papers, her expression growing grimmer with each page. "This is enough to bring formal charges in Cheyenne City. But it is also enough to get you killed if Harrow and Dodd realize you have it." "Then we do not give them time to realize," Clara said. "We call a town meeting, immediately. We present the evidence publicly where there are too many witnesses for them to simply silence us. We force a reckoning before they can react." It was a gamble, but Clara could see no other option. If they waited, Harrow would discover the safe had been breached and would move to silence them. Speed was their only advantage now. Red Hawk had been silent throughout this exchange, but now he spoke. "They will try to stop the meeting, or disrupt it. We need people we trust to protect the evidence and the witnesses." "Eli," Dr. May said immediately. "And the Hendricks family. Harrow tried to foreclose on them last year. They have no love for him, and probably a dozen others who will stand with us if they see proof." They spent the next 2 hours quietly spreading word of the meeting, enlisting allies, making copies of the most damning documents in case the originals were seized or destroyed. By early afternoon, a crowd had gathered in the church loft, the only structure large enough and dry enough to hold everyone. Clara stood at the front, her leather case on the table before her, Red Hawk and Dr. May flanking her. She could see Harrow near the back, his face a mask of calculated concern. Dodd stood beside him, arms crossed, his badge catching the lamplight. The time for subtlety had passed. Clara would lay out the evidence methodically, irrefutably, and let the truth speak for itself. "Friends and neighbors," Clara began, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I stand before you accused of sabotaging the freight engine that was meant to secure our town's prosperity. I stand before you as an outsider, a foreigner, a woman in a profession dominated by men. I understand why some of you doubt me. But I ask you now to set aside your doubts and examine the evidence with clear eyes." She opened the leather case and withdrew the blueprints, spreading them on the table. These are the specifications provided to me by Mr. Harrow. They contain a fundamental design flaw that would cause catastrophic failure under operational load. I documented my concerns before the test. I warned that the engine would fail, and it did fail exactly as I predicted. Murmurs ran through the crowd. Harrow started to rise, but Clara spoke over him. The question is not whether I am competent, my work speaks for itself. The question is why Mr. Harrow provided me with false specifications in the first place. She held up the first letter. This is correspondence from a Denver foundry confirming receipt of modified specifications per Mr. Harrow's explicit instructions. The modifications match exactly the flaws I identified. Mr. Harrow commissioned the false specifications deliberately. The murmurs grew louder. Dodd stepped forward, his hand moving toward his revolver. That document could be forged. Miss Weiss could have fabricated. I have the original ledger from Mr. Harrow's safe. Clara interrupted, producing the book, with entries matching the foundry's invoice. And I have this. She held up the second letter, the one addressed to Harrow from Dodd. A letter from Deputy Dodd to Mr. Harrow, written before the deputy arrived in Cold Creek. A letter in which Dodd addresses Harrow as cousin and lays out their plan to engineer financial crises for profit. The crowd erupted. Eli Boone pushed forward, his face flushed with fury. You planned this from the beginning. You sabotaged our future to steal our land. Dodd's composure cracked. He drew his revolver, not pointing it at anyone, but holding it ready. This is sedition. You are all interfering with lawful authority. Lawful authority, Doctor? May's voice cut through the chaos like a scalpel. You are a conspirator and a fraud, Silas Dodd. The evidence is here for anyone to see. Harrow finally stood, his face pale, but his voice still smooth. This is a misunderstanding. Yes, Silas is my cousin. I secured his appointment because I trusted him. But there is no conspiracy. Those letters are taken out of context. Then explain the modified specifications, Clara demanded. Explain why you ordered a design that you knew would fail. Explain why you marked the blueprints with your own initials. Harrow opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no explanation that would withstand scrutiny, and he knew it. But Clara had underestimated his desperation. Harrow's hand moved to his coat pocket, and when it emerged, it held a small Derringer pistol. Before anyone could react, he had grabbed Dr. May by the arm and pressed the gun to her ribs. Nobody moves. Harrow said, his voice high with panic. Nobody follows me or the doctor dies. The crowd froze in shock. Red Hawk's hand moved toward his rifle, but Clara caught his wrist. If shooting started in this packed room, dozens would die in the crossfire. Harrow backed toward the door, dragging Dr. May with him. Dodd with me? Now. The deputy hesitated, then holstered his revolver and followed. Within seconds, they had disappeared down the stairs, the sound of horses being mounted echoing from outside. The crowd erupted in chaos. Men shouted for weapons, for horses, for immediate pursuit. But Clara's mind was already working, calculating angles and probabilities. They are going to the canyon, she said quietly to Red Hawk. To the blasting powder stores. It is the only place they can go that gives them leverage. Red Hawk understood immediately. The canyon was isolated, easily defensible, and stocked with enough explosives to destroy half the town if detonated. They will threaten to blow the dam, he said, or the town itself. Force terms. Or they will use Dr. May as a hostage to buy time to destroy the evidence and escape, Clara added. Her mind raced through scenarios, discarding options, seeking leverage. We cannot let them set the terms. We have to control the situation. How? Red Hawk asked. Clara looked at the documents spread on the table, at the crowd of frightened, angry townspeople, at the Winchester rifle in Red Hawk's hands. An idea was forming, dangerous but potentially effective. "We do not chase them," Clara said slowly. "We invite them to come to us. We make them believe they have won, and then we trap them." She turned to address the crowd, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Listen to me. Harrow and Dodd are desperate, which makes them dangerous. If we pursue them directly, they will kill Dr. May and likely trigger an explosion that destroys the dam or the town. But if we give them what they want, if we make them believe they can negotiate their way out, we can save Dr. May and end this without bloodshed." "What are you proposing?" Eli asked. Clara took a deep breath. "I am proposing we give them me. I am what they want, the witness they need to silence the engineer who can verify the evidence. If I agree to meet them to destroy the documents in exchange for Dr. May's life, they will believe they have won, and that is when we take them." Red Hawk's jaw tightened. "No, too dangerous." "It is the only way," Clara replied, meeting his eyes. "You know it is. And you also know that I will not let Dr. May die because of evidence I uncovered." The look that passed between them in that moment communicated volumes, fear, respect, something deeper that neither was ready to name, but both felt acutely. Finally, Red Hawk nodded, a tiny movement that spoke of acceptance rather than agreement. "Then we do it carefully," he said. "With a plan, not reckless." They spent the next hour preparing. Messages were sent to Harrow via a trusted intermediary. Clara would meet him at the canyon entrance at dusk alone with all the documents. In exchange, Dr. May would be released unharmed. The intermediary returned with Harrow's acceptance, along with a warning that any sign of a trap would result in Dr. May's immediate execution. But Clara and Red Hawk had no intention of walking into a trap unprepared. While the message negotiations were underway, Red Hawk was scouting the canyon approaches, identifying positions, planning fields of fire. Eli and several trusted men were quietly positioning themselves in the rocks above the canyon, armed with hunting rifles and instructions to remain concealed unless violence erupted. Clara's role was the most dangerous. She would approach openly, appearing vulnerable, drawing Harrow's attention while Red Hawk moved into position. The documents she carried would be copies carefully aged to appear genuine, but ultimately expendable. The originals remained hidden in the church, guarded by men Harrow had no reason to suspect. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Clara made her way toward the canyon, her heart hammering but her mind clear. She carried a leather case identical to her own, stuffed with the copied documents, and enough blank paper to give it proper weight. She also carried a small metal tube concealed in her dress pocket, a smoke canister she had improvised, using a pinch of black powder with damp matted cloth and charcoal scrapings packed in a tin designed to produce thick, choking smoke when ignited by a friction match. It was a tool of distraction, a way to create chaos if the situation spiraled beyond control. The canyon entrance loomed before her, dark and narrow, the walls rising sheer on both sides. This was a place of death, she thought, where sunlight never fully penetrated and sound echoed strangely off stone. If she had miscalculated, if Harrow was more cunning or more desperate than she anticipated, this would be where her story ended. But Clara Weiss had not survived a childhood illness, an ocean voyage, and a devastating flood by succumbing to fear. She had survived through stubborn refusal to accept failure, through application of reason and will against impossible odds. She would survive this too, or she would die trying to save the woman who had stood beside her when no one else would. She entered the canyon, her footsteps echoing, and called out in a voice that did not waver. "Harrow, I am here. I have brought what you demanded. Now release Dr. Kittredge and let us end this." The response came from deeper in the canyon, Harrow's voice distorted by echoes. "Come forward. Slowly. Hands where I can see them." Clara obeyed, moving carefully through the narrow passage, her bad leg making her progress awkward, but her resolve unshaken. She rounded a bend and saw them, Harrow and Dodd, standing near a wooden shed stacked with crates of blasting powder. Dr. May bound to a post between them, her face bruised, but her eyes alert and angry. "The documents," Harrow demanded, gesturing with his derringer. "Put them on the ground and step back." Clara complied, setting the leather case down and retreating 3 paces. Harrow stepped forward, eagerly keeping his gun trained on her, and snatched up the case. He opened it, pulled out the top documents, and began scanning them. That was when Clara saw her opportunity. Harrow's attention was divided between the documents and maintaining his gun on her. Dodd had moved slightly to the side, his angle wrong for covering both Clara and Dr. May simultaneously. The 2 men were close together within the blast radius of her smoke canister. Clara's hand moved to her pocket fingers, closing on the metal tube. She had one chance. If she mistimed this, if the smoke failed to disorient them sufficiently, they would shoot her before Red Hawk could intervene. But she had not survived this long by hesitating when action was required. She pulled the canister, struck a friction match against her belt buckle, and hurled it at the ground between Harrow and Dodd with all her strength. The canister detonated with a sharp crack, and thick white smoke erupted in a choking cloud that filled the narrow canyon space within seconds. Clara dropped flat, covering her head, as gunfire erupted above the sound of shouting and confusion. Red Hawk emerged from cover to her left, his Winchester rifle speaking with precise authority. The first shot took Dodd's gun hand, sending the revolver spinning away. The second shot splintered wood near Harrow's head, driving him back. More gunfire came from above Eli and the others, adding their weapons to the fight. Clara crawled through the smoke toward Dr. May, her eyes streaming tears from the chemical fumes, her lungs burning. She found the doctor by touch, her hands finding the ropes that bound her. Clara's fingers worked frantically at the knots, and after several agonizing seconds, they came free. "Run," Clara gasped. "Out of the canyon. Now." But Dr. May did not run. She grabbed Clara's arm and helped her to her feet, and together they staggered toward the canyon entrance through the dissipating smoke. Behind them, chaos reigned. Harrow, realizing he was surrounded, made a fatal decision born of desperation and rage. If he could not escape, if he could not win, then he would destroy everything. He turned toward the blasting powder shed, his derringer in hand, and fired directly at the crates. "No!" Dodd screamed, realizing what his cousin intended. But it was too late. The bullet struck true, igniting the powder in one of the crates. For a split second, nothing happened. Then the world turned to fire and noise and shattering force. The explosion was massive, far larger than anyone had anticipated. The shed disintegrated instantly, and the shock wave slammed through the canyon like a physical wall, hurling Clara and Dr. May forward. They hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from their lungs, their ears ringing with a sound like the end of the world. Behind them, the canyon wall began to crack. The explosion's force, combined with existing fractures in the stone, had destabilized the entire structure. With a sound like rolling thunder, a section of wall the size of a building tore free and crashed downward, burying the blasting powder stores and everyone near them beneath thousands of tons of rock. When the dust finally settled, the canyon had been transformed. Where the shed had stood, there was now only a massive pile of rubble. No one could have survived beneath that crushing weight. Clara lay on her stomach at the canyon entrance, every bone in her body aching, her ears still ringing from the blast. Beside her, Dr. May was conscious, but dazed, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. Behind them, the canyon was sealed a tomb for two men who had chosen greed over humanity. Red Hawk appeared through the settling dust, his face grim but unhurt. He dropped to his knees beside Clara, his hands moving over her with professional efficiency, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently. "Can you move?" Clara took inventory of herself. Bruises, scrapes, abraded hands, but no broken bones. "I am intact," she replied, her voice hoarse from smoke and dust. "Dr. May, I will survive," the doctor said, pushing herself into a sitting position despite Red Hawk's protests. "Though I will have strong words for you, Clara Weiss, about the definition of a carefully planned operation." Despite everything, the pain, the exhaustion, the horror of what they had just witnessed, Clara found herself laughing. It was a slightly hysterical sound, but it was genuine. They were alive. Dr. May was safe, and the evidence was secure. The sound of the explosion brought the rest of the town running. Within minutes, Clara, Red Hawk, and Dr. May were surrounded by townspeople, some horrified, some relieved, all demanding explanations. Eli Boone pushed through the crowd, his face pale. "Harrow and Dodd?" he asked. Red Hawk gestured toward the rubble-choked canyon. "Dead. Buried. They chose to destroy rather than face justice, and they destroyed themselves instead." It was a grim end, but no one mourned them. The men had been given every chance to surrender, to face legitimate judgment, to accept responsibility for their crimes. They had chosen otherwise, and the consequence had been swift and absolute. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal proceedings, community rebuilding, and personal reckoning. The territorial authorities arrived from Cheyenne City, investigated the circumstances, and confirmed that Clara's actions had been justified self-defense. The documents she had secured proved the conspiracy beyond doubt, and Harrow's estate was seized to provide restitution to those he had defrauded. But the most significant revelation came not from the documents Clara had found in the safe, but from a separate investigation, triggered by the territorial inquiry. Authorities digging into Harrow's business dealings discovered that the steam engine design had never been legitimately his to sell or license. The design had been stolen. Records from Vienna showed that an Austrian engineer named Carl Weiss developed the revolutionary high-pressure system in 1874. During the winter of 1875, while Carl was dying of consumption, a business partner named Gregor Steiner absconded with the drawings and shop books. Steiner sold the misappropriated designs to American intermediaries, who in turn conveyed them to Harlan Harrow. The entire chain of transfers rested on theft and deceit. She found herself quite suddenly in legal possession of valuable intellectual property, with applications far beyond Cold Creek's freight industry. Red Hawk found her in the courthouse anteroom, as he always seemed to when she needed him most. He sat beside her in silence until she was ready to speak. It was stolen from him. Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. Everything he worked for stolen by a man he trusted. And Carl died believing he had failed, that his design was worthless. He never knew it would travel across an ocean and be worth fighting for. Red Hawk listened, then spoke quietly. "But you knew. You recognized its worth, immediately defended it against accusations, proved its validity through your own skill. You honored your brother's work in the most profound way possible, not through sentiment, but through competence and courage." Clara looked at him, at the steady strength in his weathered face, at the understanding in his riverstone eyes. "I could not have done it without you. You saved my life. You stood beside me when no one else would. You risked everything for a woman you barely knew." "I know you now," Red Hawk replied simply. "I know your courage, your mind, your stubborn refusal to accept injustice. You are the strongest person I have ever met." He paused, his hand finding hers. And I know that I do not want to face the world without you beside me. Clara's breath caught. It was as close to a declaration of love as Red Hawk's practical nature would allow, and it meant more to her than any flowery poetry. I do not want to face it without you either, she whispered. I choose you, Red Hawk, not just for today, but for all the days ahead. His hand came up to cup her face, his calloused thumb brushing away her tears with infinite gentleness. Then, we build our life together, he said. Whatever comes, we face it as one. He kissed her then there in the courthouse anteroom, a long, slow kiss that spoke of commitment and promise and hard-won trust. Clara's arms came around his neck, holding him close, feeling the solid reality of him, the warmth and strength that had carried her through the worst days of her life. When they finally parted, both were smiling through tears. Summer came to Cold Creek, with fierce intensity transforming the flood-ravaged landscape into something new. The town rebuilt, learning from disaster, strengthening foundations, and raising structures above the high-water mark. Clara made a revolutionary decision with her newfound ownership. Rather than selling Carl's design to a large company for immediate profit, she established a licensing cooperative that allowed Cold Creek and surrounding communities to build and operate engines collectively with profits distributed among members. It was a bold experiment in communal enterprise, and it attracted attention throughout the territory. She also established a workshop in Cold Creek, not just a room, but a proper building with space for drafting, assembly, and teaching. The first steam engine built under the new arrangement was completed in late July. When Clara activated it, the machine hummed with the smooth, powerful rhythm she had always known it could achieve, the sound her brother had died trying to create. Red Hawk stood beside her as the flywheel spun and said quietly, "He would be proud." Clara nodded, unable to speak, for the tightness in her throat. In early August, as sunset painted the prairie in shades of gold and amber, Red Hawk took Clara riding. She had been practicing growing more confident on horseback, and now she sat before him on his Mustang with something approaching ease. "I have been thinking about building," Red Hawk said as they rode slowly through the grass. "A house. A real house, not just a lean-to. For both of us, if you would want that." Clara turned to look at him, heart-swelling. "A house. Between your workshop and the prairie edge," he clarified. "Close enough for your work, far enough for quiet. Good water, good view. A place that is ours, built together." He paused. "What do you think?" "I think," Clara said slowly, "that I would like that more than anything. To build a home with you, Red Hawk. A place where we both belong." His arms tightened around her waist, a gentle embrace. "Then we start soon, before winter comes." 2 weeks later, on a clear August morning, with aspens turning gold on the mountainsides, they stood before a small gathering to speak their vows. There was no minister, no church would marry a white woman to a Cheyenne man. But they had witnesses who mattered: Dr. May Eli and his daughter, cooperative members, and 3 Cheyenne from Red Hawk's distant band who had traveled to honor this union. "I choose you," Clara said, her voice steady, her eyes locked on Red Hawk's. "I promise to stand beside you, to build with you, to honor your strength and your heart. I promise to face whatever comes together, to work together, to create something that lasts, for as long as I live." "I choose you," Red Hawk replied, his voice resonant with emotion. "I promise to stand beside you, to protect what we build, to honor your mind and your courage. I promise to face whatever comes together, to work together, to build a life of meaning, for as long as I draw breath." They exchanged simple silver rings, inscribed with a single word: together. Then Red Hawk cupped Clara's face in both hands, and kissed her a long, thorough, passionate kiss that communicated everything words could not. When they finally parted breathless and flushed, the small gathering erupted in cheers. Wildflowers' scattered songs were sung in Cheyenne that Clara did not understand, but whose joy was unmistakable. That night in Clara's house, that would soon be replaced by the home they would build, they lay together and spoke quietly of the future. "We start the foundation next week." Red Hawk set his fingers tracing patterns on Clara's arm. "Stone and timber thick walls for winter. And a good stove for the workshop," Clara added. "I want to work through the cold months." "Always working," he teased gently. "You love that about me." Clara replied, not a question. "I do," Red Hawk admitted. "I love your mind, your hands, your stubborn refusal to surrender to anything." Clara turned to face him, her hand tracing the scar through his eyebrow. "I love your strength. Not just physical, but the strength to stand alone when necessary, to help without expectation, to be steady when everything else is chaos." He caught her hand and kissed her scarred palm. "We are well matched." "Yes," Clara agreed. "Very well matched indeed." They held each other as sleep came, two people who had found not just love, but true partnership. Not just passion, but the kind of steady commitment that would carry them through whatever hardships the frontier might bring. The house they built that autumn became a landmark in Cold Creek. It was not large or grand, but it was solid local stone and timber-pitched roof, large windows, workshop wing for Clara, stable for Red Hawk's horses. They worked on it side by side, Clara drafting plans while Red Hawk selected materials, both doing physical labor within their capabilities, hiring help from the cooperative, and paying fair wages. By late October, as first snow threatened, they moved into the finished house. On their first night, they stood at the window, looking out toward distant mountains, a fire crackling in the hearth behind them. "We built this," Clara said softly, almost in wonder. "Together." "Yes." Red Hawk agreed, his arm around her waist. "And it will stand long after we are gone. A testament to what two stubborn people can accomplish when they choose each other." Clara leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "To what we built," she whispered. "And to what we will build in all the years ahead." Red Hawk pressed a kiss to her temple, and they stood like that for a long time, watching the sunset, feeling safe and chosen and home. The steam engine hummed its rhythm in the distance, Carl's dream finally realized. Clara's workshop waited for new projects. Red Hawk's horses grazed peacefully in the corral, and between them all, in this house built by two people who had survived together, a new chapter was beginning. Not perfect, not without challenges ahead, but real, earned, and filled with the quiet promise of all the days to come. Together.